This week we continue our discussion of the nature of ultimate reality with an examination of the Buddhist concept of paticca samuppada, or dependent origination. The argument for dependent origination is ultimately very simple. Under careful analysis, none of the phenomena that we encounter in our ordinary experience are permanent. This implies in turn that none of them have the power of being in themselves, but are dependent on other things for their existence. Unlike Hellenic philosophy, which takes for granted that there cannot be an infinite regress of causes, Buddhism embraces such a regress, so that rather than concluding to being the good, the true, the beautiful, and the one, that is, to God, Buddhism argues that everything depends on everything else. In place of the Hellenic vision of God drawing all things to herself, we have the suggestion that we all live in each other's embrace. While most Buddhists believe in devas and asuras, or gods and other superhuman beings, they regard these beings, while very long-lived and vastly more powerful than we are, as mortal and subject to possibly painful rebirths. Just what does this mean, and what are the implications for the way in which we live our lives? The doctrine of dependent origination is interpreted very differently by different Buddhist traditions and philosophical schools. Theravada Buddhism, which is dominant in Sri Lanka and most of Southeast Asia, teaches that everyone must achieve enlightenment on their own, through many lifetimes of accumulating merit, culminating in many more of contemplative practice, almost always as monastic. Most Theravadins follow one or another of the Abhidharma schools, which interpret dependent origination to mean that everything arises through the interaction of atomic dharmas, or momentary phenomenal events. Under analysis, everything dissolves into aggregates of such events. The result is that everything is impermanent. Therefore, there is nothing for us to become attached to, and no self which can become attached. There is, therefore, no reason for suffering. It is in the Theravada tradition that the non-theistic character of Buddhism is most fully apparent. Not only doesn't anything have the power of being as such, but there is no effort to create or even approximate this power. Mahayana Buddhism, which is the dominant form of Buddhism in most of China, Japan, Korea, and parts of Central Asia, teaches that full Buddhahood is a real possibility, and that the highest calling is that of the Bodhisattva, who remains in samsara, working for the enlightenment of all beings. Bodhisattvas can assist others in seeking enlightenment in ways that vary from one tradition to the next, sometimes just as modest teachers, at other times creating entire pure lands where seeking enlightenment through compassion and meditation is far easier than in our own world. There are, in turn, a number of different Mahayana philosophical schools. The Madhyamaka school teaches that all dharmas are empty, so that even the momentary events which form the bedrock of reality for the Abhidharmikas are an illusion. Nothing has inherent existence. This is the school which, probably because of its austerity, has the greatest prestige, though it is often interpreted in a way which reflects the influence of the Yogacara school. The Yogacara school teaches that only mental impressions are real, as we know nothing except our own minds. Eventually, most Mahayana schools develop the idea of the Tathagatagarbha, or Buddha nature, which everything has, but which has been covered over by the illusion that things have inherent existence. When we realize this underlying truth, understanding that everything is just a vast interdependent network, we become capable of effectively infinite power to use in advancing the enlightenment of others. Some Buddhist tendencies even embrace the idea of Vairocana, a sort of primordial Buddha who, while not a creator god, has many more of the characteristics of God than the Devas and Asuras acknowledged by other Buddhists. Early Mahayana schools tended to emphasize the gradual nature of enlightenment. They built large monastic establishments and charted elaborate hierarchies based on the many stages on the long way towards full Buddhahood. Lay movements emerged around these monasteries that promised anyone who had faith in one of the advanced bodhisattvas, such as Amitabha or Guanyin, would be reborn in a pure world which looked suspiciously like a monastery, where they too could spend their lives meditating in a beautiful garden. In China, most of these monastic establishments and their associated lay movements became so powerful, controlling as much as 40% of the land and having their own private armies, that the emperor repressed them during the late Tang dynasty. Similar developments took place in other parts of East Asia. The Chan or Zen tradition emerged in its place, Zen required smaller monastic establishments and taught the possibility of sudden enlightenment by meditation on koans or paradoxical statements which promote insight into dependent origination. In Southeast Asia, the early Mahayana establishments tended to be under royal patronage, but here too they eventually became too expensive and collapsed, leading to the Theravada reform under the influence of monastics from Sri Lanka. Something like the older monastic establishments persisted only on the frontier between China and India on the Himalayan plateau. Here, Adivasi and Tamil influence from India and Taoist influence from China helped lead to the development of Tantra, which mobilized the idea of the Tathagata-garbha, or Buddha nature of all things, to develop meditative techniques and psychophysical practices that led to a more rapid approach to enlightenment. Ordinarily, these involved primarily complex visualizations, but at the highest level, or for some popular cults, they might also involve highly disciplined sexual intercourse and the consumption of forbidden foods, such as meat and alcohol. Where do you stand? Do you find the concept of dependent origination more or less credible than the idea of God? Is it really possible to be an atheist without embracing dependent origination? And what are the implications of this idea for an atheistic spirituality?